Howdy, friends. Welcome back to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Andy Vance, joining you along with Al Kertz, regular contributor to Feedstuffs and one of our guests each month here on Feedstuffs 365. When we have Dr. Kertz on, we talk about a variety of opportunities and challenges with regard to how we raise our calves and dairy operations. But this month, we wanted to take a look at what we do with those male veal calves, and particularly as it relates to one of the biggest health challenges that producers have in keeping these calves healthy, and that's dealing with the challenge of diarrhea. Dr. Kertz, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to share a little bit of the research and your latest column in Feedstuffs, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Friends, if you have questions for Dr. Kertz as he goes through his presentation today, do please put those in the comments on wherever you're watching this. If you're on feedstuffs365.com, just type in your comments in the chat area, the Q&A area there below. If you're on social media, just please put those questions in the comments section of whichever social platform you're on, and we'll ask those of Dr. Kertz at the end. All right, Al, floor is all yours, sir.
All right. Thank you, Andy. First, a little background. If we look at the last National Animal Health Monitoring Survey done in 2014, they reported that for pre-weaned heifer calves, 24% of them basically had diarrhea, and about half of those also had a respiratory problem. Before weaning, the mean death loss is due 57% to diarrhea and 23% to respiratory incidents. But the average death loss in 2014 was 6.4%. Now, this is a little bit complicated because if a calf has a diarrhea, it's also more likely to have a respiratory problem. So some of this kind of gets overlapped. And this relates to two of the three critical time periods I think of for calves. The first one is at calving, and that's the condition of the environment, the pen, the cleanliness, how clean the cow is, how clean the colostrum is. So that's the first period. The second one is the first 2 weeks, because that's when most health problems and death losses occur. And most of those that we just talked about are due to contamination and diarrhea. And then the third one, which we won't talk about today, is the 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after weaning. And I would call that the weaning transition. Now, this particular study, though, only relates to female calves. So what happens with the male calves? Well, in some cases, it appears they don't get much attention because they may be sold right away to somebody who comes around and picks up calves, or they may go to an auction barn, sale barn, or there's also what are called drovers, or people who pick up calves on dairy farms and deliver them to the auction barn. So they may not always have the right environment to be born in, or treated afterwards, or given colostrum and so on. So that's an issue. Now, in Canada, in Ontario, the study we're going to talk about is done at University of Guelph. There are a fair number of veal operations still. And so a group at the University of Guelph did this study. And they had about 2,600 male Holstein calves. They were monitoring them at a veal facility from 2018 to 2020. And they were bought in batches of 80 calves. And then there could be 4 rooms at a time. And then they would start out in separate stalls or slatted floors. And then after 49 days, they would be, the dividers of stalls would be removed, and then they would commingle them into groups. And then let's look at now the feeding program, how they fed and handled these animals. Which I won't get involved in all the health parts, including the vaccinations, because I'm not a veterinarian and I won't pretend to be one. But in terms of feeding, they started out with a 26% protein, 17% crude fat milk replacer, fed it 13% solids, And they would feed for the first 2 weeks. They fed about, let's see, what does it say here? About 520 grams a day in 2 separate feedings. And then in the following days, from 15 to 21 days, they increased that from 520 to 650 grams. And then they further increased that to 450 grams twice a day. So now they're up to 900 grams or close to a kilogram. And then they started staging that down so that they weaned them then at the end of 70 days, or 49 days rather. They also, though, because of differences from the old traditional veal programs, they also fed them a starter. And this was a classified as a texturized starter. So it had some corn and pre-mixed pellet. And they mixed that with 2% straw, come up with a 17% protein, 44% mix. So they fed that. All right. Now, if we look at what they did, they were able to collect a lot of information. So, for instance, they collected when they arrived, what day they arrived, and they collected them where they came from, whether they came from sale barns, dairy farms, or drovers. They measured serum total protein because that's the best indicator of did they get colostrum, did they get enough? And actually, they did pretty well. They averaged about 5.7 as serum total protein. And then they weighed them at various intervals. They also had a fairly detailed fecal scoring system to measure degree of diarrhea. And if it scored at a 3, that was watery, and a 4 would even be worse, and so on. And then they measured how often they had this, what days they had it, and so on. They also looked at, let's see, yeah, they looked further at they looked at, they weighed them, so they measured daily gains. But before we get to that, I want to briefly review this study that was done at the University of Illinois when they looked at their various trials they'd done over the years and combined them all together. So they had a good data set. And they found that calves that had diarrhea, they had 27% lower daily gain than the other calves. And of course, they ate less, had poor feed efficiency, and lower growth parameters like hip height and so on. So from that study, we know that if they have diarrhea, they're likely not to do as well. So if we look at this Guelph study, and Andy, if you want to put up that graph, I'll give you some background to what they found. You can see from this graph, though, that they primarily had diarrhea about a week after they started on this trial. But now keep in mind that these calves were anywhere from 3 to 10 days old when they came to this facility. So if you add those two periods together, these calves are about 14 days old when they have major diarrhea. And that's similar to heifer calves as well. So that's a similar pattern. And of course, you see on that graph the different colors, and that indicates the degree of problems they had. But about 16% of the calves had significant diarrhea, and then another 6 or 7% had severe diarrhea. Of the calves that had, of all the calves, 47%, or roughly half of them, came from local dairy farms within 30 kilometers. About a third from drovers and only 20% from auction boards. They were sourced throughout the year, more so in the fall than the spring and the summer. Mean body weight was 105 pounds, so they're large male calves. And they're, we talked about the mean serum total protein is 5.7. 36% had less than 5.2. That's kind of a cutoff point, meaning you're kind of in a red zone. Within the first 28 days after arrival, that's the amount of time they actually did the measurements for 28 days. They 16% had greater than, equal to, or greater than a 2 score, and 6.7, almost 7% had greater than a 3. But there was a great deal of variation. Like the 16% that had diarrhea, plus or minus 13%. So it's almost as big as that mean value. 6.7 plus or minus 9%. So there's a lot of variation. But keep in mind, they had a lot of calves, which really helps in collecting information like this. And they also saw a relationship to the initial body weight. The more body weight they had, the proportion of calves with a fecal score greater than 2 decreased by 7%. On the other hand, the greater the body weight to start with, they had a lower daily gain. And this may sound a little contradictory, but what happens sometimes is the bigger calves maybe are even bigger in frame, but they've lost some weight when they come. And so it takes them a little bit to catch up, to pick up, and get back to eating well and doing as well. During the trial, 2/3 of them, 65%, were treated with antibiotics for diarrhea. 2/3. 71% were treated for respiratory disease. So that's a very high rate. We would not want to see that in heifer calves on a dairy farm, but that's the reality of picking up bull calves and bringing them to a facility and so on. So that's what they saw there. The average daily gain for the first 14 days was only about 1/3 of a kilogram. So that's about 0.7 of a pound. And then as they grew more and ate more, the average daily gain for the whole period was right at 1.9 pounds, or almost 2 pounds. But again, a lot of variation, because that 1.9 average had a plus or minus of 0.48 pounds. So even with a lot of calves, you see a lot of variation. And then, of course, when they looked at the source of the calves, it was greater for those that came directly from farms. And that's probably not too surprising, because you probably had better environment there, less commingled, whereas the other sources were more commingled. The average death rate was 8.9%, and primarily due to diarrhea and low serum total proteins. So when you have diarrhea, it's most likely coming from the environment where the calf was born and the colostrum administration, because the colostrum often can be contaminated and be dirty. And so if it's not pasteurized, then you're going to be inoculating the calves when you feed them colostrum. Let me see about some of the other things here. I mentioned already that the Illinois study and those data. So we can see that the picture of male calves in relationship to diarrhea and death and health problems is a greater challenge than it is for female calves, because the female calves are born on the dairy farm. They're usually fed and cared for at least a short period of time, even if they go to calf or heifer operations. So that's kind of a summation of this whole area.
Dr. Kertz, good column as always. Friends, if you're watching at home and have questions for the professor, would you please put those in the comments area below on Feedstuffs 365, or in the comments of whichever social channel you're watching. We'll get through those, as many of those as we have time here before the bottom of the hour. Al, one thing I was thinking about as you were summarizing there is, what are some of the the takeaways, if I wanted to take the information gleaned from these various studies you talked about and better optimize my operation. Obviously a little different if we were talking about, as you said, the heifers we're keeping on the farm and the dairy, but any broad takeaways that you want producers, nutritionists to take home from this body of research, things that, hey, you really should pay attention to this and put it into practice in your place.
Well, it tells us with a high incidence of diarrhea in these male calves, and almost 2/3 of them are treated with an antibiotic, that diarrhea is a really severe problem. So diarrhea generally shows up in about 2 weeks, and that's the amount of time from birth to be for the pathogens to be growing and incubating and break out into outright diarrhea. So the best thing we can do is go back to the calving environment. How are the conditions when a cow has a calf? Is she in a separate pen? Is it well bedded? Is it cleaned periodically, at least periodically, if not between cows? So, what's the environment in which the calf is born? How clean is it? As the old saying goes, we don't want it to have a manure meal at that young age, but in a dirty environment, that can happen. And then, how is the calf handled from the time the cow calves till it goes to a hutch or whatever it is? And how clean is that environment? And then, in addition, how clean is the colostrum?
Mm.
We can't assume the colostrum is that clean. There are studies that show that as much as 75 or even up to 90% of colostrum is contaminated. So if it's contaminated, then you're feeding the calves the pathogens through the colostrum. And if you're going to pasteurize colostrum, then you have to have a batch pasteurizer system. You can't use a flow through system like you can for waste milk. So those are some of the things. If you do that area really well, you're going to not eliminate, but you're going to minimize most of the problems that you see. And so that's why that's such a critical situation, is the environment add calving.
And of course, I'm also thinking too, that's directly applicable to this situation and trying to mitigate diarrhea, but doing those things well pays dividends in other aspects of the operation as well, right? I mean, it's not just, hey, if
Oh,
you get a clean calving environment here, we're going to diarrhea these calves. I mean, that's going to pay dividends for the overall health and well-being of the herd.
yes, it will. And just as you saw in this study, and they found in the Illinois database, if a calf has diarrhea, it's not doing as well. It's not digesting and absorbing nutrients as well. Has to be fed electrolytes. That takes more labor. It increases your cost for the electrolytes and treating the calves, particularly if you treat it with an antibiotic. Then that calf is lost a period of several days or sometimes maybe a week before it recovers. So it won't gain as well. It's more likely to have a respiratory problem. And calves that have a respiratory problem, studies have shown, are impaired for life, even if they recover after you treat them. So they have more health issues. They don't perform as well. And we know from other studies now, various databases, that the daily gain of calves during the first 2 months is directly related to their milk production in their first and subsequent lactation. So we want to minimize not just death loss, we want to minimize health issues, because we know that if we do that, it's going to pay off in their lactations down the road when they're heifer calves. And in this case, if they're veal calves, they just simply aren't going to grow as well. So they won't have as efficient growth and feed conversion. It will increase the cost, and that'll show up in the market price.
Yeah, we're losing value on every one of those animals then
Yes.
in that scenario for sure. Had a great question from the audience here. What are your thoughts on bathing the gut with IgGs during that first 14 days of life? Does that help colostrum deprived calves at all?
It may, because some of the IgGs are their mode of action is in the gut, and others have to be absorbed. So you wouldn't get the absorption after the first 24 hours from the IgGs, but it can have benefits in that. It's interesting you raise that question because that's going to be a future subject. Another study done at the University of Guelph where they use colostrum to treat calves who have diarrhea. So I'm going to hold off further on that until we get to that session.
You teased, Dr. Kertz. That's great. Okay. I look forward to doing that in a future session. And I want to thank you, Dr. Al Kertz, for a wonderful column again this month and for talking through some of the findings of this research. Friends, if you want to read the full column, you can do that at feedstuffs.com. Go to digital editions there at the top of your screen. Find the latest issue of Feedstuffs and read Dr. Kertz there. Of course, you can also go back and find his previous columns and previous editions as well. Okay, we've got a busy week this week on Feedstuffs 365. I'd encourage you to come back tomorrow for another great discussion. Same bat time, same bat channel. You can find all of our upcoming events as well as our previous sessions available on demand by visiting feedstuffs365.com. Until tomorrow for Feedstuffs, I'm Andy Vance, wishing you a great rest of your day.